so much. I'm really excited to be here. I would do just about anything for Rob Walker, but even beyond that, I love talking about brands, and I love talking about the constructs that we create to understand brands. Interesting that Rob's work is all fictional brands, because all brands are fictional. And I'll talk about why. So as Julia said, Why We Buy, Why We Brand is the name of this talk, and it's a bit of an anthropological journey in how we have created these things around us that we live with, that we love, that we sleep with, that we consume and enjoy and have all sorts of relationships with. But this really began somewhat naively. I'm going to say about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe a little bit less, my goddaughter asked me why I thought MySpace was so popular. Does anybody remember MySpace? And I didn't know. I had been certainly aware of the phenomenon at the time about the extreme involvement that people had with the brand. I went online and signed up and had my own little MySpace account. I found the interface to be really ugly, so I don't think I ever went back. But I still didn't know the reason why it was so popular. Certainly not the academic reason. And I felt that as someone that was considered a brand consultant, somebody that was giving my clients in general, all sorts of guidance, that I should know why, at the time, the most popular brand, probably in the world, was as popular as it was. And so I started down a bit of a rabbit hole in an effort to answer this fairly innocuous question. It turned out to be a bit of an ongoing investigation, and it's really not quite done yet, and I always have a little bit of apprehension about this being taped, because I'm going to make a joke now. It's a bit like a Grateful Dead concert. It's always a little bit different every time I do it. And only really old people laugh at that joke. And so I now have a sense of the age range of the audience. I gave this presentation recently at a school of undergrads, and no one laughed. Like, no one. And I think actually people were like, huh? Who's dead? Did somebody die? In any case, so it's a bit of an ongoing investigation into our behavior in relation to the brands that we've created and the things that we buy and the things that we surround ourselves with. And it really starts from what I consider to be the beginning of modern branding. 150 years ago, and I'll talk a bit about why that amount of years is so relevant, building a brand was a rather straightforward endeavor. A logo was a telegraphic guarantee of a product's consistency, of its quality. It was a signal that the product was perhaps new. And for that, consumers at that time were very prepared to pay a premium for that brand. And in that time, in this 150-year span of years, we've gone from this to this. This is an average supermarket. We are now living in a world where we are selling over 100 brands of nationally advertised contact lenses. We are also selling over 100 brands of nationally advertised water. There are some people that don't think you should be selling any water at all. If you were to go into Starbucks and mathematically calculate how many options you could have, whether it be size, syrup, milk, foam, etc., you would be able to have your choice from 19 million different types of coffee drink. There are over 47,000 malls in the United States. What's really interesting is if you go into those malls, you find that they're rather homogenous. There'll be a Gap or a Macy's or an Old Navy and a coffee store, a Gloria Jean's, maybe Starbucks, maybe a Tiffany's if it's upscale, a Zales, or a Kay's if it's not. This is a recent headline a couple of years ago that I found to be rather troubling. Walmart narrowly avoids more Black Friday deaths. I think the operative word here is narrowly. As people were stampeding to get low-cost electronics, they killed each other. I love beverages, love beverages, I drink them all the time. This is 64 ounces. 64 ounces. Mike Bloomberg wants to change whether or not we could buy things this big, and people are outraged at the notion that they couldn't buy 64 ounces of a beverage in one sitting. Now, you might think that this is going in one direction in terms of this sort of rampant tirade about how horrible this is and what a consumerist society we're living in. But I'm not going to do that. Nor am I going to tell you that this is an amazing way that shows that capitalism equals freedom. What I am going to talk about is that how even in the backlash movements against brands, or in statements or exhibits about brands, all of the very tenets of branding are being used by the people that so obviously disdain them. There are websites, there are logos. If you go to the Adbuster site now, they're having a fundraiser in which they're selling Adbusters branded sneakers to raise money. So it's not really about whether it's bad or good, this presentation. This is really about why do we do these things? Why do we behave in this way? Why do we interact with brands in the way that we do? And even though it's probably not as relevant as it might have been 7 or 8 years ago, I am also going to tell you why MySpace was so popular, just so you know. So I'm going to start way back when, and I'm going to go way back before that 150-year mark that I mentioned. I'm actually going to go back 50,000 years ago. I recently did this presentation to this group of young people, and my brother was in the audience, and when I asked him what he thought of the presentation, he said it was good except for the science part. It got a little dull. So I'm going to try to make this really peppy part of science that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about how 50,000 years ago, our brains underwent a major transformation. Scientists call this the Big Brain Bang. And this was a result of a major reorganization of our brain, and it resulted, this genetic mutation resulted in our brain forming into the modern infrastructure that it now has. So our brains are actually 3 brains. We talk about the left brain and right brain very often when thinking about rational thought, emotional thought, when we talk about logic, when we talk about creativity. But really, I'm going to be talking more from a lateral perspective. So the 3 parts of the brain which make up what is called the triune 3-in-1. The reptilian brain, the limbic system, or the limbic brain, the mammalian brain, and the neocortex. More poetically, scientists also call this the Great Leap Forward, this particular time in our history, primarily because this is when we really began to be the modern version of who we are now. So I'm going to do science stuff real fast. So our human brain encompasses 3 distinct brains, as I mentioned, the reptilian brain, the neocortex, and the limbic brain. And the reptilian brain, which we share with all of our reptilian cousins, crocodiles, snakes, this regulates heartbeat, it regulates digestion, and all of our other basic life functions. If I were to suddenly, mysteriously, push this microphone over and start screaming, you would all be like, ooh. But you wouldn't do that consciously. You wouldn't do that voluntarily. You would do that involuntarily. And that's a really, really remarkable reaction that we have, which immediately means that what we're doing is protecting ourselves. And that's a truly extraordinary trait that we share with many, many, many other species on the planet. This is one of our oldest behaviors, this need to survive, and we share that with almost every other species. The reptilian brain, though, it does not support any emotion or cognition. The neocortex, marketers love the neocortex. It houses speaking, writing, reading, planning, awareness, will, and in many ways these are the functions that we most associate with being human. The limbic brain is the seat of emotion, it's the seat of play, it's the seat of attachment. This part of the brain is the part of the brain that allows us, that conveys that sense of need that we have to be around others. So for example, mammals all rear their offspring live. We don't hatch eggs. reptilians hatch eggs. And if they're not happy with the eggs, they actually might eat the egg. We are, in many ways, pre-wired to care for our young. We have a very long gestation period. It would actually be longer. That's why when people talk about how long they have to raise their children, they have to raise their children for as long as they do, primarily because our brains aren't finished growing. So the best reason to encourage 18 or 19-year-old people to not get married at that age is because their brains are still continuing to grow, and they might have radical changes by the time they're 20 or 22, when it's finally fully grown. We wouldn't be able to come out if our heads were that much bigger, and that requires our brains being a certain size when we come out, and then that 18-year span where we continue to grow. Thank you for visiting. I always tell my students, if you laugh at my jokes, you'll get better grades. So our mammalian characteristics really do distinguish us as much as our cognitive abilities do. So this great leap forward, it was responsible for all of our modern abilities, language, art, music, cooking, self-decoration. These are fundamentally considered cultural universals in that basically everybody everywhere, despite your religion, despite your orientation, despite anything, really, we all behave in ways in which we're using these things. And after the Great Leap Forward, there was a sudden explosion of tool making, more sophisticated weaponry, cave painting. And as I looked at all of these behaviors and I tried to make sense of how they evolved, I saw that if I deconstructed them, I could probably deconstruct them into two very basic categories. The first is making. We were making things. And then the other is marking. And I think as designers, this is where the skill and our ability first took hold. And you see, our first markings came as cave drawings. And these cave drawings date shortly after the Great Leap Forward in science time, 32,000 years ago. Not that much of a difference between 32 and 50 in the sort of grand scheme of the space-time continuum. Early artists colored cave paintings and pottery, and they used a wide array of pigments that they actually were able to take from nature. Extraordinary ingenuity. And they were really quite beautiful. And here is where we started to first document our lives, our rituals, our experiences, and these became our memories and our documentation of our humanity. During the Lower Paleolithic era, we started to manufacture stone tools. We carved shelter out of rock. This is an extraordinary find. This is a photograph of a wild flax fiber from a series of Upper Paleolithic layers that indicated that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were actually starting to create what I call the first mobile device. They were able to create threads and then cords that allowed them to create baskets or bag-like containers to be able to move from one place to another, carrying more than they could hold on their arms. Animals weren't domesticated at that time. Nobody was putting like a big saddle on a cow and like filling up the saddlebags. So we were able to, at that point, begin to move to places that had more food, better environmental characteristics, and this is also where our relationship with dogs first took hold. Dogs and humans have the same circadian clock, and when we were sleeping, dogs would be sleeping. When we were moving, dogs would be moving, and they'd sit around our campfires and wait for the scraps. As we moved from campsite to campsite, the relationship that we had with dogs became closer and closer. 32,000 years ago, they might have been sitting on the periphery of our world. Now they're sleeping in our beds. But dogs were used first to help us carry the things that we were bringing from place to place. Archaeological finds show that women and men both were applying makeup and arrayed themselves with ornaments starting at about 10,000 years ago. And this is a trend that really began more from religious convictions than beautification motivations. Around that time, we also started to create marks to signify our religious beliefs. We began to create crests and shields to telegraph our lineage. And we started to develop and design our flags. Now, interestingly, flags were first used to assist military coordination on battlefields. There were no mass-marketed uniforms. Nobody was like sitting and designing the stripes that you'd wear to convey what you believed at that time. So flags were used on the battlefield to assist in military coordination. They've since evolved into a general tool for signaling and identification. But it's interesting, just from a philosophical point of view, to think that we needed to indicate or telegraph that we were different by something that we were wearing, because there was maybe no other way for us to assess that. Interesting how we create these constructs, and that's also why everything that I'm talking about is a construct, as are the brands and the products that Rob has created today in this gallery. So the word brand, where did it come from? Where did it originate? The word itself was first used in the 1010 Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, that literally means to mark or to destroy by fire. I do this more for students than anyone, but I'm not talking about the movie. I'm talking about the old English heroic poem of unknown authorship. And thank you again. The concept of branding began to evolve as a way to signify via the use of fire or a mark that something belonged to someone else. So the concept of branding was first used to identify livestock belonging to a particular rancher. Brands were actually first painted on animals with pine tar, and then for speed and efficiency, hot iron brands were used. Brands as we know them now, as we interact with them, this modern age of branding, really originated in the end of the 19th century. And this was before the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to say before the Industrial Revolution, products and services were really associated with people rather than organizations. There was a Mr. Kellogg's, and there was a Mr. Procter, and there was a Mr. Campbell's, and there were Mr. Gillette. King Gillette was actually his name. And the values that these entrepreneurs brought to the marketplace were as much personal attributes as they were professional ones. And businesses at that time weren't in factories or in big box stores. They were primarily housed in the home. So you'd have a business that was co-located with a residence, and the store was in the front, and people either lived upstairs or in the back. It was only really in the advent of the Industrial Revolution that factories began to be frequented as a home, as a place for business, and the notion of somebody leaving the home and going to the factory and then coming back home at the end of the day further created a way in which culture has organized our roles. So it was really at this time that major changes in agriculture and manufacturing and mining and transport began to affect the socioeconomic times. Probably the most important was obviously transport. And what ended up happening was we would be able to go to, say, a little shop on a main street in Cincinnati and buy Coca-Cola, and take the railroad and go to New York and buy Coca-Cola. And despite the water being fundamentally different, those Coca-Colas would taste the same. Interesting, though, if you go to Europe now, how different a Coca-Cola tastes there. That's the recipe, not the water. So customers that were previously familiar with only locally produced products began to see these pre-packaged products as superior. They were more convenient, they were more novel, and it's interesting to see how that tide has changed in this 150 years, and how now the locally produced, you measure the amount of miles from the farm to the table, and that's something that actually causes the owner of that brand to be able to justifiably charge a premium. So the Trademarks Registration Act went into effect on January 1st, 1876. Brands became legally recognized. And with the advent of the U.S. Trademark Registrations Act, we had literally thousands of people clamoring to get their brands registered so that nobody could copy those brands without some type of legal ramification. Does anybody know what the first trademark brand in the United States was? Nobody from Sterling or my students are allowed to answer. Bass. Good enough. Yeah. Okay, so this is the first trademarked brand in the United States. It's not American. And I kind of love what it says about us as humans, that the first brand, the first registered brand in the United States is an alcoholic beverage. I kind of just love that. Now I'm going to show you one of my probably top 3 favorite slides in this presentation, which is the first case of product placement. So the Edward Manet Fresh Impressionist, 1882, and isn't that amazing? But most brands were not sold in bars. The U.S. grocery stores actually descended from trading posts, and the trading posts sold clothing and household items, and trading posts ultimately evolved into the larger general stores. At the time, they primarily dealt in dry goods such as flour and canned foods. Perishable foods were bought from specialty markets, butchers, local dairies. Eggs and vegetables were produced by families themselves or bartered for with their neighbors. Until that point, customers would give their orders to clerks to fill. There was no sort of moseying about and looking at the shelves. You had to actually tell the clerk what you wanted, and then he or she would give that to you. 3 years after the Trademark Registration Act, though, in 1869, the Great American Tea Company opened a store on Vesey Street, so just around the corner, and began selling tea, coffee, and spices. And the Great American Tea Company is now named the Great American Pacific. So what has happened since then? How did we get to 100 brands of nationally advertised water? Well, believe it or not, what I've done is plot the evolution and the launch of just about every major brand that has come to market since 1879, and I have a lot of time on my hands. And what I've done is organize them into different categories to be able to make sense of how the conditions led to the conditions that led to the conditions that led to MySpace being so popular. So you see the whole exercise was just so beneficial. But really, what I needed to be able to do in looking at MySpace was, well, what were the conditions around MySpace that allowed MySpace to happen? And then what were those conditions? And then what were those conditions? And before you know it, it was 50,000 years ago, and our brains were being reorganized. So, 5 waves of modern brand evolution. I'm going to talk about how each evolution gave way to the conditions that allowed the next to flourish. But what's also interesting, as I organized these buckets or waves, I noticed that each wave essentially corresponded with a huge cultural evolution that really led to this type of behavior becoming more viral. So wave 1. Here we are in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Brands are guaranteed as quality and as emblems or labels for quality and consistency. It was a recognizable symbol of quality and consistency, and this was represented by this label or corporate identity, which were at that time the paramount attributes of mass production. These packaged goods signified that they were premium, and it gave the person that was buying them some type of intellectual justification that it was worth spending more for. These were the leaders at the time, so brands like Campbell's, Coca-Cola, Quaker. These were among the first products to be branded, and they were branded really in an effort to really increase the consumer's familiarity with those products. So if it was always the same logo, it would always be the same product. What ended up happening is because these products started to really make money for their owners, as in any industry at any time in our history, there began to be people that were creating those same products, but they were fake products using the same name. And so Procter & Gamble was one of the first companies that actually created a mark, a telegraphic mark, that they could embed in their products, which were at the time candles, that allowed the person that was buying those candles to know that they were genuine, legitimate Procter & Gamble candles. You expected that these brands would be safe. This was because the original Food and Drugs Act was passed by Congress in 1906, June 30th, 1906, and it legally prohibited misbranding or adulterating any food, any beverages, or any medicine. It really wasn't taken that seriously until 1921. In 1921, There was a case that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was called the U.S. versus 95 barrels of alleged apple cider vinegar. Alleged apple cider vinegar. And the Supreme Court ruled at that time that any statement, any design, any device on a product's label could not mislead or deceive. I think this is, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that this is the first time the word design was found in a U.S. Supreme Court motion. That meant that people were legally entitled to buy brands that were honest and safe. It wouldn't kill you, it wouldn't make you sick. Wave 2. This was the beginning of the brand gold rush. People saw the Kellogg's of the world and Procter's and Gamble's making money. They saw it as easy money, and everybody wanted in on the action. So this is when you began to see all the Me Too products. You saw the Pepsi's, for example. This is when brands suddenly began to be developed that had similar attributes, that had similar taste profiles, but had different names. How are you going to be able to differentiate to a public that was used to seeing things one way? And that was how we started to evolve our experience and our expectations of what a label stood for. So there were copycat products in categories like soda pop, like hot and cold cereal, and even salt. So brands became anthropomorphized because there needed to be a way for consumers to be able to connect with these products. So these were some of the leaders at the time, the Morton Salt Girl, Betty Crocker, Uncle Ben. The common denominator that all of these characters share is that they never, ever existed. They are not real. They are not anything that was ever actual. But they provided differentiation. They provided an endorsement. And in many ways, they provided the first consumer relationship. Now, what's interesting about the Morton Salt Girl, and I find the Morton Salt Girl incredibly fascinating. She was created in 1914, and she's telling an entire story. This is a storytelling device, the first storytelling device. Here she is walking, it's raining, she's carrying an umbrella. The canister of salt, unbeknownst to her, is leaking salt as she's walking. Like, why? I was fascinated by this when I was growing up. I would stare at this thing and, what, doesn't she know? Is she going to get in trouble when she gets home? I mean, these are the things I really spent a lot of time thinking about. As it turns out, the Morton Salt original tagline was, "It pours," P-O-U-R-S, it pours. Nobody really cared. Salt should pour. But what happened was, the way that Morton differentiated from all other salt products on the market was that they actually chemically altered the crystal. The salt crystal was then created in a way that prevented it from sticking to other salt crystals when it rained or when it was humid. So if you go into a diner today and you go and look at a salt shaker and there are little kernels of rice in the salt shaker, it basically means it's not Morton. Morton has a patent on that ability to chemically alter the crystal so that it doesn't stick together when it's raining or when it's humid. If it's raining and it's humid and it's not Morton, you have to put some rice kernels in to soak up the humidity so that the salt doesn't stick to each other. Fascinating. The tagline then became, "When it rains, it pours." Betty Crocker was so enthralling a personality when she first was launched that people actually called General Mills and asked the switchboard to put them through to Betty Crocker because they wanted to talk to her, because she had such an engaging personality. Her voice was all they really knew, because she was the voice of the soap operas, the voice of the commercial that General Mills used during the soap operas. And lest you think I'm exaggerating, this is an ad that came out. I don't remember the date, but suffice to say it's during the radio age, the golden age of radio, wherein the headline is, "To the man who wanted to marry Betty Crocker." Some stalker guy called General Mills asking for Betty and loved her so much, proposed to the switchboard over the phone asking to please marry Betty Crocker. So what happened was you could basically relate to and project onto a character via the use of these anthropomorphized beings. I'm going to show you one of the most popular at the time as well, Snack, Crackle, and Pop. Anybody notice anything unusual aside from their like ears and whatnot in their outfits? Basically everything about them is weird, but they're all looking down. Their eyes are all looking down. 4 modern cereal boxes, eyes looking down. Rob Walker's fake Krusty O's, he got it right, eyes looking down. Because when kids are walking in the supermarket and they see these boxes of cereal, they connect with the eyes looking down because they're looking up. It's quite crafty, those cereal companies. But I'm not being judgmental. Wave 3. Oh, you know what I want to tell you about another anthropomorphized character? You know who I consider to be the first viral meme? Santa Claus. Santa Claus is red and white because of Coca-Cola. Santa Claus was green before Coca-Cola got their little hands on the brand. Coca-Cola created this outfit for him to wear on their packaging, and we loved it so much we've just taken it over for the entire holiday season. Wave 3. Brands are self-expressive statements. Things get really interesting here. Culturally, we're in the middle of the biggest social revolution of our generation, and the idea of a label starts to evolve into much more of a comprehensive set of ideas and associations, not just functional or emotional or metaphoric like our little Morton Salt girl, but also they expanded to the self-expressive. So in other words, if I wore a pair of jeans or a pair of sneakers, at that time, this is about the real apex of this happened in the mid to late 70s, it was telling you something that I wanted to communicate about myself in wearing these things. So the notion of wearing a pair of Levi's or a Lacoste shirt or a specific pair of sneakers, which were primarily used prior to Adidas and Nike making them so popular in sanitariums, when people were going for a rest. Those were the shoes that they wore that were more comfortable. That said something about who I was. I remember being in junior high school and desperately wanting a pair of Levi's because somehow I thought if I wore a pair of Levi's, I wouldn't look so much like a chubby, Jewish, pimply girl from Long Island. Suddenly, if I wore a pair of Levi's in the 7th grade, I would be cool. Didn't work, but I thought it could. So if I were wearing something, that would then communicate to others who I was. And this is really when brands, I think, began to be used as a projection of not who we are, but who we want to be. A brand could provide status. These were some of the popular brands at the time. Anybody know this one? Marlboro. So Marlboro hasn't been advertised in over 20 years. But yet we're all completely familiar with the vernacular. I'm going to show you another image in a little while that has the same effect that's only been around for a much shorter period of time. But Marlboro wasn't always Marlboro in the same way that Rob created all of these brands. Marlboro was created. Marlboro was originally a cigarette that was marketed to women. It began in England in 1847. It was initially targeted to females. I love some of the language here. Ivory tips protect the lips. I mean, I smoked for a really long time, but I never smoked while I was skiing, ever, ever. But aiming at this market was not successful. So in the 1920s, the Marlboro was started to, because of health concerns later on, as health concerns were becoming an issue, the brand was marketed to men because the use of the filter made it slightly more healthy than not having a filter. And most of the men that were smoking at that time were smoking brands that didn't have filters. So it was about the 1930s, 40s, 50s. Marlboro was again brought back to the market, at this time on the heels of stories about the negative health aspects of smoking, and they created the tattoo man. So the first icon of this new change in marketing was the tattooed man that's depicted on this page. So the filter cigarette would be unfiltered taste. Here we have various images of healthy-looking outdoor types. They started showing up in the ads. The images that were used evolved more and more into these particularly macho types. They first were using naval officers and livestock ranchers, but by 1954, the well-known Marlboro Man was introduced, and by 1963, he was the sole representative of Marlboro cigarettes and Marlboro ads. And this is kind of what it looks like now. Just found this recently, I thought it was interesting as a comment. Way 4, brands become an experience. You expected some type of an emotional transformation in your engagement of the brand. Brands that were the leaders at the time, Disney, an experience marketing example. Apple does more than social devices. They design experiences that get you. Learning experiential marketing from Starbucks. Here you were expecting some type of an emotional transformation. There's almost a movement of sorts, a rapture. Wally Olin stated that the commercial, anthropological, and sociological branding processes that professionals engaged in then created visceral distinctions to evoke immediate responses. Before we get to wave 5, I want to talk a little bit about those conditions again that led to MySpace being so popular. And I want to talk a little bit about some of our basic instincts. And I'm going to let you know up front, I'm also going to take a couple of sidebars, some I think fun, entertaining sidebars that show how other things were evolving at that time as well. So I want to talk a little bit more about our basic instincts. Our basic instincts as humans: food, shelter, reproduction. Scientists disagree on whether survival, the need to survive, is an instinct. But I'm going to put it up here for the basis of my argument as to why MySpace became so popular. But we also, as a species, have a significant collective tendency, and that is that nearly every species organizes itself in some type of pack. And I think the instinct to survive creates this tendency. We feel safer and more secure in groups. And the odds become far less that we are going to get injured if we are with others that also have a chance of being injured. It sounds terribly unpolitically or politically incorrect, or certainly not altruistic, but that is part of our way of thinking. We feel safer and more secure in groups. And we see this everywhere. We see it in fish, we see it in ants, we see it in birds, we see it in dogs, cats. This is a photograph that I took in Alaska of sea otters in sub-zero temperature. Monkeys, humans, we do this with the things that we're wearing, certain behaviors. It's not just our clothing, it's also our beliefs. Here you see hippies, Hells Angels, yuppies. Like, there was a time when we thought that was cool. Hipsters, and then of course armies that are fighting for our belief system or our religion or our values. And what once seemed really exotic is now one of my students at SVA. And what once seemed tribal and foreign is, like the cashier at Trader Joe's, the bartender in Brooklyn. And what seemed unusual or even kind of weird, we see all the time now when World Cup comes around. Although I still think this is weird. But the most pervasive pack organization of all is one that we all belong to. We often take it for granted. It's the family. This is the typical American or Western European family. This is an Amish family, Peruvian family, Muslim family. And what's interesting from a scientific perspective, the need that our brains have to connect with others comes from what is now considered to be attachment theory, to feel secure when that person is present, to feel anxiety or stress when that person is absent. And the origin of these theories can be traced to the publication of 2 papers in the late 50s, John Bowlby's The Nature of the Child's Tie to His Mother, in which the early concepts of attachment were first introduced, and then Harry Harlow's The Nature of Love, which was based on the results of experiments that showed that infant monkeys prefer emotional attachment to food. So these experiments gave monkeys essentially the choice: starve to death or be held by a caretaker. Monkeys always chose care, from the being cared for or held by the caretaker. Would rather die of starvation than not have physical contact. The worst punishment that we can now inflict, there's a remarkable article in the New Yorker, I think it was last year or the year before, that showed that the most cruel torture that we can inflict on another human being is actually solitary confinement. That we will have an emotional break with reality far quicker when we are in solitary confinement than when we are tortured within inches of death. We will go crazy faster in solitary confinement. So we feel the happiest about who we are when we have secure feelings of attachment to other people. We feel better when we're surrounded by other people that we think love us. So our secure feelings are, we have the higher self-esteem, higher sociability, we feel the best about ourselves when our brains are resonating with others that feel similarly to the way we do, whether that be about food, whether that be about love, whether that be about behavior. But, big but, there is a population trend that is flying in the face of this need. More and more people on this planet, particularly in the United States, are living alone. We are now living in a day and age where 1 in 2.87 households are comprised of one person. One person. As a researcher, as an analyst, this is staggering. Staggering. In 1950, 1 in 10. That's what we call statistical significance. That is huge to have that kind of staggering shift. What's even more interesting, I think, from a cultural perspective, is how those people living alone are perceived. So, in 1950, if you were a person living alone, you were either sort of that weird uncle, or you were a spinster, an old maid. And what's interesting, and this is one of the sidebars I'm going to take you on, the role of women in entertainment since 1946. And how that's changed, the attitude of what it meant to be a woman living alone in the world. So in 1946, a movie came out called It's a Wonderful Life. Probably everybody's seen it now because it's the time of the year. So in that movie, Donna Reed plays James Stewart's wife. And in the movie, James Stewart undergoes some sort of terrible, terrible occurrence. It's so terrible that he wants to commit suicide. And he goes to a bridge and he's about to jump off, and an angel intervenes and wants to show him why he needs to live. Because if he hadn't ever lived, how awful the world would be. How much the people in his life would suffer because of different directions that they would have taken had he not been alive. And they were terrible. One's a drug addict, one's out in jail. The way that they depicted Donna Reed's character, the terrible, horrible thing that would happen to her if James Stewart wasn't alive, was that she would be a librarian.
She's in the library!
Thank you. She would be an unmarried librarian. Like, that was the worst thing that could possibly happen to a woman in 1946. If she did marry James Stewart, this is what she'd look like. So all she needed was marriage and children, and she would be beautiful, vivacious Donna Reed, and not drab, dismal, miserable Donna Reed. So this is really interesting. There's this shift that occurs in this acceptance of what it meant to be a woman living alone in our society. So we first meet 1960s. We meet Marlo Thomas. Anybody here familiar? I just want to get a sense of anybody familiar with Marlo Thomas? I'll get like 4 people. Okay, so in 1960, this television show came out called That Girl. And in this show, Marlo Thomas was a single woman living in New York City. That was basically the premise of the show. It was so provocative, it was so outrageous, it was so sort of unthinkable to imagine a woman living alone in New York City that it was fodder for a 5-year run on television. And what was interesting about this is that Marlo Thomas, that girl, did have a boyfriend. He was a bit of a buffoon. Her father was humiliated because she was living by herself. The show lasted 5 years on the air. At the end of the run, the network wanted Marlo Thomas to get married. And that would be like the end. She said no. She said she wanted to show women that there were actually other alternatives for their lives. And that led the way to Mary Tyler Moore. Here we had the 1970s. Mary Tyler Moore, big storyline. Again, she moved to Minneapolis by herself. Big storyline, she went from secretary to associate producer. One time, Mary Tyler Moore went on a date and slept over a boy's house, a man's house. Outrage. The show was almost canceled because of the idea that Mary would sleep over somebody's house. It was so morally decrepit. And she slept on the couch. And it was clear. But nevertheless. Then we go into the 1980s and we meet Murphy Brown. Murphy Brown, also a single woman living alone, but she has this guy that sort of takes care of the house and he's often there, so she's not fully living alone. It was still tremendously shameful, but not enough to, again, provide humor for a network. But she has a scandal as well. She has a baby out of wedlock. 1980s, she has a baby out of wedlock. The vice president weighs in. Cover of Newsweek. How our morals as a society and as and the sense of who we are was doomed because of stories like this. We are now living in an age where more women are actually having children outside of being married than in. And that's how fast that has changed. Murphy Brown leads the way to Ally McBeal, who has multiple lovers. She works at a place with a co-ed bathroom and has a scandal as well. This actually forces the show off the air. She sells her unfertilized eggs to help her pay for her college education. About 3 or 4 months after the child, who's now 15, knocks on the door, the show goes off the air. But she did lead the way to Carrie Bradshaw and all of the girls in Sex and the City, who actually end up having sex in every possible position, in every place known to man. They all live by themselves, and here you see 60 years of the trajectory of what it means to be a woman living alone in our society. But it has nothing to do with MySpace. So where does that leave us? What is this fifth wave? The path to wave 5, I want to look a little bit again at what we're doing in our homes and how we are connecting, how we're living. Wave 1, if we were lucky, we were listening to the radio. Wave 2, here we see the advent of the television, the black and white television. There were maybe 5 channels, 3 were national, 2 were local. The number of televisions in households reached over 10 million in 1948. In 1950, there were 10 million. In 1946, the time of we were watching It's a Wonderful Life on television, there were only 190,000 televisions in the United States. And if you had one, that meant that you were pretty well off. And after the war was over and Americans settled down and began to indulge in more television programs, it began to be more popular, it began to be more mainstream, but it did take 35 years for 150 million Americans to own a television. By comparison, it only took 7 to own cell phones. Only 7. Wave 3, television got colorized in 1964, but color televisions didn't overtake those of black and white until 1972 and 1973, and at that point, about 10 million sets were sold. And the early 70s also saw households with color televisions go over 50% at the time. I remember when that happened in my household. There was still no remote, so I was my father's remote. He'd be laying down in bed or on his lazy boy, and he'd yell for me to come and change the channel. Wave 4. Here we have first talking cell phones and TV, another brand that we can barely remember, Blockbuster. I'm going to show you that other telegraphic image that I told you I was going to show you that's very similar to Marlboro, instantly recognizable. Doesn't matter where or who you are. I think everybody in this room knows what she's doing. Anybody not know? Or can everybody see? We can just tell by the way she's holding her chin and the glare in her glasses. So if we were to look at this from an evolutionary standpoint, I think it would look something like this. But what were we doing online in Wave 4? What were we doing? What's interesting is that we weren't doing the same things that we're doing now. 10 years ago, we were spending our time online emailing, shopping, playing games, porn. Porn was the #1 industry on the internet at that time. All changed in 2001, not because of 9/11. 6 weeks after 9/11, Apple introduced the iPod, and wave 3 and 4 combined instantaneously to create social cachet and an experience. And now it's so ubiquitous that everybody on the planet has one. But if you think back to that time between 2001 and 2005, the iPod was actually rather criticized. And it was being signified as a device that was actually creating a sense of isolation in human beings. Suddenly we were immersed in our headphones, and we weren't as aware of the outside world. We were disconnecting from other people, and this was written about over and over and over again. So if you look at some of the headlines at the time, you see Isolation Nation, you see iPod era of personal media choices maybe turning us into an isolation nation. And I'm going to move over so I can read some of this. Sorry, it's so blurry, but it's basically saying that they came across an article saying that Americans are now saying that more and more than ever before, since 1985, they have no one with whom they can confide in. And then, of course, one of the biggest statements of all, the New York Times, December 2004. It's not that long ago. December 2004, James Katz, as a communication professor at Rutgers University, attributed the iPod's popularity to a trend in the American culture toward withdrawing from the public sphere or the public culture into one's private space where you can have complete control over your entertainment. The iPod psychologically depopulates social space for you. It increases isolation and anonymity. So 5 years ago, you could have found the average person shopping, playing games, writing email, reading newspapers and blogs, which were also kind of newish at the time, 8 years ago. But our brains created an entirely new way to find a connection in this depopulated, isolated space. Our brains invented new frameworks in which to connect. And so while before we were looking at porn or playing cards or looking at the J. Crew catalog, remember when that went online? It was like, oh my God, the J. Crew catalog is now online. Then, what did we do? Our brains invented new frameworks in which to connect, and that's why MySpace was so popular. We needed, in this space that we were all in, to find ways for our brains to resonate with others. So we've created new social communities now, wherever and whenever we can, and the popularity of brands and websites providing community, providing companionship, a sense of belonging, like-minded mutuality are the most popular brands at the moment. And they just keep volumetrically increasing over and over and over. Now, what's interesting though is, I interviewed Dan Formosa about this phenomenon, and he said that he didn't think that people are in love with the technology or the devices. He thinks that what they love is that they found a personal connection to someone, either from across the room or across the world, with whom they share a common bond. And they're in love with the effect that that has by connecting with people. Recently, the internet dating industry surpassed the porn industry as the #1 industry online. I think that's hopeful. So what I call wave 5 are limbic brands. Any brand that fosters the ability to create mutual experiences, to share or relate. They are brands as connectors. And I think that branding has now become a profound manifestation of the human condition. It is about belonging. It's about belonging to a tribe, to a religion, to a family. We subscribe to sites, and that becomes something that we are part of. Branding demonstrates this sense of belonging. And this functions both for the people who are part of the same group, as well as for people who don't belong, to create a delineation. So I'm going to just wrap up with talking about a path to understanding why we brand. I want to look at an anthropological journey, a little bit of our making and our marking. What did we start with? Where are we now? Our lower Paleolithic era tools detonated nuclear bomb in 1945. Our documentation of our daily experience. Our documentation of our daily lives. This is a 2,000-year-old sculpture that is in the Tala Museum in Mexico. This is an interesting sculpture in that it depicts what we considered to be beautiful at the time. So elongated heads, crossed eyes, and pointy ears were all the rage. And now we have our new constructs for what we consider to be beautiful. Our basket-making fossilized threads, and now what we can do with thread now, or at least what Alexander McQueen can do. Our fastest mode of transport in the 18th century. And now, speaking of fast transport, 160 years ago, Paul Julius Reuters set up an information service. He later renamed it Reuters, using a fleet of 45 carrier pigeons to deliver news and stock prices. At that time, Reuters pigeons carried the messages faster and beat the railroad in delivery time. That's how Reuters began, with birds. Malcolm Gladwell has said that we've been upending, reshaping, and redefining the norms of social interaction for 150 years. While we think we're in the midst of massive change, we are constantly changing and inventing, and that this cultural change usually comes from some type of innovation, and that innovation is iterative. And so I'll show you our favorite device, and the evolution of our favorite device, the device that we can't ever put down. This is the first candlestick telephone, named because it looks like a candlestick. This was the first payphone. The first rotary dial, 1963. The first push button. You didn't actually have to turn the dial. More people in the United States lived in New York than any other state at the time. That's why it was a 212 area code, less turning for the most people. 1980s, having the push buttons in the cradle is really savvy. First cell phones. This is 1983. This is a answering machine in 1983. This is my answering machine in 1983. When I got my first answer, it was the first thing I bought from my own apartment in New York City. I graduated college in 1983. My father was appalled. He could not understand how it was possible he could raise someone that was so narcissistic that they needed to know who was calling them when they weren't home. Just couldn't understand it. Now, 29 years later, we have the sixth sense. This is an innovation coming out of MIT, which lets you project a phone pad onto your hand and phone someone without ever removing your phone from your pocket. What's interesting about this technology is all of the other ancillary industries that have now been developed. Tom Peters said that Gutenberg's press was not really that big of a deal. The big deal was the industrial production of paper so that you could use the damn press. And I think that's really interesting when we think about what else we're using our phones for now. The most popular thing that we use our phones for are the apps. And that's what gives us the sense of freedom with these new ways of using things. So as makers and as markers, and I'm assuming that that's all of us, we can choose to make things like this, or we can spend our time to make things like this. We can use blankets and make things like this. Or we can use those blankets in another way and make these things. We can drive around in suburbia in cars that are the vehicular backbone of the U.S. Armed Forces, or with something that's a slightly smaller carbon footprint. These are all choices. In the same way that Rob has created all of these choices, all of these decisions in making fake brands, everything we make is up to us to make. People talk about those sort of bad corporations and the bad behavior. But the corporations are just collections of people that are behaving in this way. We make these choices. This is what we can do with our technological prowess. This is a still from a very popular video game. Or we can do things like this with our technological prowess. We can do things like this with straws. limited edition. Or we can do this is Vestergaard Franson's Livestrong. He developed this in 2005, and it features an innovative filtration technique that actually makes dirty water drinkable anywhere. Forbes magazine listed Livestrong as one of the 10 things that can change the way humans live. So when we think about the marks that we make, the constructs that we build, I'd like to leave you with some of the notions of what people that I've spoken to and interviewed have said about what brands can do. Cheryl Swanson said that marks tell us stories about our place in culture, about where we are and where we've been. They help us figure out where we're going. We can create marks that signify or inspire a mood or a movement. We can create marks for movements like this or like this. Wally Olin stated, nowadays we call them logos, but really all they are symbols of what lies beneath. So to answer the question of why we buy and why we brand, I think that the process of making and marking is an evolution or a trajectory of invention. And I think that that is an extraordinary ability that only humans have. We have the power to further our humanity or to destroy it with the constructs that we create and the things that we mark and the things that we make and the things that we brand. And I think where brands fail us in our expectation of what they can do are the very constructs that we create and tell ourselves that they can provide us. As Dan Pink said, if a big screen TV is your source of stature and significance, it's a fool's game. These kinds of external things do not provide enduring satisfaction. If a brand is making a promise that you're going to feel better about yourself if you buy it, they're going to make a false promise. Human beings metabolize their purchases quickly. But not just our purchases. Human beings metabolize everything quickly. Everything. The world is just one giant planet of regulation. I can have a glass of boiling water here and another glass of ice water here. Go away for 4 hours, and when I come back, they will be the same temperature. Everything on this planet is constantly being metabolized. Think about when you eat a big meal. You eat a big meal and you eat so much that you think, I never ever want to eat again. And 4 hours later, you're like picking through the refrigerator. Same thing with love. You fall in love with somebody, you can't get enough of them, you think about them all the time. 3 years later, you're like, stop breathing like that. We metabolize everything, everything. So, as Stanley Hainsworth has said, we have the ability to reveal this truth. And I hope we can do it before before the term branding becomes just another generic, overused, and misunderstood word. And finally, Malcolm Gladwell stated, never before have we had these kinds of communication technologies in the hands of those who have the greatest desire to communicate. People. How we choose to use these technologies is entirely up to us. So I hope we can choose wisely. Thank you for laughing at my jokes, and have a happy holiday.
Oh, sure. Are there any questions for her while she's here?
Questions?
Thank you, Susan.
Yes. Augmented reality. Augmented reality. No, I'm not a futurist. I consider myself to be an analyst. Like maybe the guy in the back, Beta, the guy, my favorite, he might be able to tell. But I'm not a futurist. I don't know. I love to make sense of the past.
But this is about communication. And we're really increasing of technology and how we have but within 5 to 10 years, everyone needs something right now. Everyone will have another question. I think that will be the next big thing.
I'm a great person for that. I would love to think that singularity is coming. But that's mostly because I just don't want to die. So I don't know. I don't know. I always get the question. I'd love to have a really pithy answer. that gives everybody a sense of like what's coming, but I don't know. I don't know. I could tell you, that what happened 10 years ago, 150 years ago, 50,000 years ago, but 2 years from now, I got nothing. Sorry. Yes.
I don't have a question, but going back to the brain, I saw this really interesting documentary that pointed out, and it made me see things differently, it pointed out how our brain is actually inside our skull. So everything we experience is actually through our brain, and our brain gets the outside world, not by actually being in the outside world, but by our sensory, our five senses, our eyes, and so on. So to our brain, something that we see on a computer or on a TV is as real once we get into that space as if we were actually in it. So I think that's why our social connections can sometimes feel as real, even though if we were to analyze it.
Well, we crave our brain resonating with others. If we're living alone, if we're communicating primarily on a device, we are going to need to create some type of construct, at least that's my theory, that we need to create a construct in which our brains can resonate with others. Otherwise, we feel somewhat incomplete. And I think that the reason why people talk about being addicted to the technology is the same reason that we can become addicted to people or that we're addicted to interaction. It's not so much addiction, it's the need. It's this basic human need to resonate with other humans. And if we're doing this in this environment, and that's where we're getting a lot of our satisfaction, then of course we're going to want to keep doing it. That's what Dan Formosa says. But it's not so much that it's the technology, it's the feeling of connected that is so profound to us. And I think we all feel really connected to that device because that gives us the connection to other things. If we didn't have that connection happening elsewhere, whether it be through email or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, I don't think that we'd be clamoring to carry around, our Betamax with us. Yeah, yes, I'm sorry.
I thought it was interesting that you talked about social brands as sort of a response to the iPod. So technology, a little bit of isolation, and all of a sudden we needed to feel social. You mentioned 9/11 though happening 6 weeks prior to the release of the iPod. I always thought that, and I hypothesized that social media was a response to 9/11 because suddenly everyone had this big thing to talk about, and we all had this like massively crazy experiences. Not just in our society, but worldwide. Everyone felt it. So to what degree do you think that plays a role?
I think that that's a way that we communicate now because MySpace and YouTube and brands like that didn't come for another 4 years. I think that we were building something that we could communicate and share. It's real. Oh, you know what? You can probably read any William Gibson book and know the future because William Gibson actually predicted YouTube in 2003 in pattern recognition. So in pattern recognition, he talks about the footage heads and their search for this piece of film, these weird, crazy people that were spending their time uploading images, moving images online. They were called footage heads. And then in Spook Country, which came after, he predicted our using GPS technology. And I remember reading and thinking, this is never going to happen. Oh, right, he got it right with YouTube, with GPS technology. Like, guess who's addicted to Foursquare? So I think William Gibson. But I do agree with you. I think that the first thing we do when something global happens is check and see what's happening online. And in fact, I think that what that's allowed us to do is have global conversations about Anne Hathaway's wardrobe malfunction. But I mean, and it's interesting because you can have this sort of continuum of conversations in that regard. What is somebody's wardrobe malfunction, and what happens when you start reading about what's happening in Connecticut. I was following it all day on Friday on Twitter, and what's interesting is that so much of the information was actually inaccurate. But I felt more connected to it. I felt somehow that I knew what was happening in the world. Yeah. Yes.
So in wave 5, it seems to me like that's a set of tools that allows individuals to communicate their own personalities with one another. So How do you think like self-branding relates to all that? I mean, is that within Wave 5 or is that kind of?
No, what's interesting is that all of these original brands were all, they were created by a person, by someone who named them after themselves, and they had embedded in those brands their personal attributes. I think it's just a modern reflection of that. I don't think that Martha Stewart is really that much different than Betty Crocker, except that Martha's real, at least right now.
So has that always been a constant across all waves? Like,
I think so,
Yeah.
I do. I mean, I think that the notion of personal branding as a construct is now something we think about and that people plan for, and they think about how they can extend their brand, or they think about how they can monetize their brand. It's just a formal way of doing what was already being done 150 years ago.
So,
I'm sorry. No, it's okay.
okay, so since Wave 3, we have this experience that our social connections are sort of influenced by a construct of belonging that comes from having brands or using brands or buying brands, wearing brands. And I was wondering if you have thought about the way that our social relationships have been shaped by the continuation of these waves, and of course with social media that already has, has probably intensified or been changed quite dramatically again, but through the mere use and the infiltration of brands to all aspects of life, especially youth culture and so forth, do you see, or did you think about the way the social relationships and communities have actually been like completely altered, like the way we connect to people, like, or for what reasons we connect to people?
Well, I think that in its most basic form, the brand is really just a projection.
Exactly. So is the social relationship real? Is it based on really my personality and that I really like somebody and that
It's based on what
you know,
you want other people to believe.
So there is a lot of shallow connections, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it
And
depends
you
on what
might
it
not
is.
notice it.
If you are using a handbag to convey certain attributes of who you are, then you have to look at why is that important, or is that important to others. Whereas if you were wearing a Jewish star or a cross around your neck, what is that saying about the other people, that you are having those same like-minded values or the sort of vision for who you are, how you want to live your life. It is all a construct. How we judge it is completely subjective. The interesting thing that I find, the fascinating thing that I find, is that we all use these things
Yeah, and I
in
was
the same way. Whether it's a backlash, or whether you're pro logo or no logo. You're using the logo.
yes, using the logo, and I think with social media, especially Twitter and those like personalities that emerge on the social networks, people want to become the influencers and the representatives of the brand, so they want to even more be identified with the brand and be paid by brands to use certain things for not really clear reasons. I'm not sure exactly for which reasons, but I see there's even more shallowness and even kind of more distant connections happening that are mistaken for.
But it's
real
interesting
social
because I
connections.
think that shallowness isn't inherent in the brand. The shallowness is inherent in the behavior.
It's not inherent in the brand.
Yeah, not really. We're just projecting these attributes into these brands. Whatever you're using the brand for is what's giving you power. Your motivation using that brand is giving it its power.
You don't think it's the marketing
But those are
department
people.
of the brand?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But you believe it or you don't believe it.
Right.
But you are giving it its power.
Right.
The people that are creating the marketing and the people that are buying the marketing are giving it its power. Yes, please.
I'm curious, in the presentation, you didn't spend much time about media. And so if you look at your phases, first phase, adopted by newspaper, second phase, radio, third phase, TV, fourth phase, cable TV channels, and now we're in this era where the number of outlets and media is infinite. And I'm interested in
But getting
Well,
people,
a sustainable brand is,
yeah, so getting people to buy into what that brand stands for is actually really
How
hard.
do you do that in a environment where, again, everyone's out there, thing works, and how do some become brands and others, become masters?
That's a good question. Ultimately, you have to keep moving. You have to keep growing and you have to keep getting bigger. Because if you don't, somebody's going to overtake you. And that's the world that we're living in now. Small brands don't stay small forever. Most of the time they get acquired by bigger brands that either want to ruin them, like Instagram, or want to steal their intellectual property. So, like Method, which was just sold. So and that will, again, change the way, change the recipes, change the flavors, change the marketing, and before you know it, it'll be just like any other cleaning brand because it's no longer being owned by the people that had the passion and the belief in doing something for a specific reason. Suddenly that reason changes. So I think that it's very, very rare to have somebody make and create a brand and they want to keep it small. It's very rare. There are maybe, I would say on the planet there are probably less than 100 brands like that. Most brands, and it's sort of similar to the internet. You have the VCs that come together to get this money together and then you create this entity with the notion that one day you're going to sell it and make more money. And the sense of brands being altruistic experiences are probably only valid until they're purchased by somebody else that wants to be able to monetize the brand further. So, I mean, it's a very interesting time that we're living in that we are, where small brands just don't have the ability to be on a global stage. It just costs too much money. It costs too much money in slotting in the supermarkets. It costs too much money to advertise. Brands that do well are brands that spend money to do well. They have to advertise a certain amount of money. They have to have a certain social media strategy. They have to pay to be global. I mean, you don't just go to a supermarket and say, hi, can I put this on the shelf and sell it? You have to pay to do that. And so the slotting fees alone prevent even the smallest of brands from being able to have any real impact for a very long time. Did that answer your question? Yes, and then yes.
So along those lines, there seems to be a shift in the big box stores and the big shop small and the small brands and things that are that. And something you go and sell the brands of your companies, but do you see a shift in valuing the smaller companies, smaller brands more than the big ones? Because it feels like definitely in cities.
Well, more progressive places, yes.
So then that grows out eventually into the suburbs.
It's a continuum. You'll get a backlash to the backlash to the backlash to the backlash. And that just keeps moving, keeps changing. And our needs keep changing. It's interesting, I was asked today to talk about green marketing and how people say that they want certain things. And then when they're in the shopping environment, more often than not, they don't get what they say that they would do. So, as Michael Berger would say, we all say that we want to eat broccoli, but we really just want to eat ice cream. And that's the way we shop. That's the way we shop. You know, I often say we wouldn't be selling, marketers wouldn't be making peach-flavored powdered iced tea if somebody wasn't buying it. Because nobody is going to put a product on the shelf for altruistic purposes. They're going to do it because they want to get a return on their investment. And if peach-flavored powdered iced tea is going to get them that return on their investment, and somebody's actually going to keep buying it, then they're going to keep making it. So we have that power, but we have to have that movement that says, no, we're not doing this anymore. We don't want to buy these kinds of things anymore. And the only way that people will stop making them is if they're not making money with them. So it's the groundswell. And if it's not going to change unless we make it change. I think there's a man there and then.
Yeah, I saw that there's a really interesting aspect to large corporate brands in that large corporate entities are now introducing micro brands in the
you know, it's sort of, you know, they were doing the green thing, or they were, you know, doing the greenwashing thing, and now because there's this desire for local microbrew, small batch, artisanal products. But that's because that's what people want. Hopefully, if we want more of that, I mean, part of me thinks any of that is okay if it changes our culture. If it does actually get people to behave differently, then it's okay. So what? Kraft wants to make some artisanal chocolate. Fabulous. If people want to buy it, and they buy it, and then people around them, the corporations around Kraft are like, oh, look, people are doing different things, they're buying it, then they'll make something else too, and then we'll have better choices, and we can have better health, and we can all live happily. Yeah, but consumers are savvy now. I mean, we you know, Richard Kirschenbaum said, consumers are like roaches. You can spray them with marketing material for a while, and then they just realize that, you know, they'll figure it out. People figure it out.
I was going to comment on, you can't, the other way to break through, I think, is to do something that fits in there, for instance, Tom's shoes, where he offered a pair of shoes to children in need in Latin America. And I think that really, you show you make choices, and if you can find an angle that makes people feel good about